So the topic I wanted to talk about tonight, I'm calling growing lotuses from the mud of our shame-filled shadows. And this is, that comes from a meme that I posted last week from Thich Nhat Hanh in honor of his moving on. And that quote said, see if I can remember it, said, if you know how to work with the mud, you can grow beautiful lotuses. And so I like this idea. We can think of the mud as being our. I'm gonna go ahead and mute everyone. So you can think of the mud as being our shadow, those shameful parts of ourselves that we don't like to look at, that we're ashamed to look at, that society, and most times that society taught us that we need to be ashamed of. But if we look at these parts of ourselves with honesty and with compassion, lots of times, most of the time, these things that we're ashamed of, whether it's addictive tendencies or tendencies to overeat or overwork or other unhealthy relationship dynamics, any of these things that we're ashamed of, most of them are coping mechanisms that we developed somewhere along the way to deal with our unresolved emotional wounds that we didn't have the skills or knowledge or support to process and deal with when they happened. So I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this idea that our childhood wounds are often too much for us to deal with as children. And so we learn to repress those emotions and lock them away. And then we develop some kind of coping mechanisms to protect ourselves from suffering that same wound moving forward. And then these coping mechanisms that we develop as children often, or maybe even sometimes later in life, these coping mechanisms then affect us throughout the rest of our lives, and sometimes cause us to either continue to create that same wound for ourselves, or sometimes pass that wound on and inflict that same wound onto other people. And so it just creates this unhealthy cycle of these emotional wounds. When we don't know how to resolve them, we don't know how to integrate them and process the pain and emotions that we felt from them, we tend to just keep perpetuating them either on ourselves or on other people. And so one example comes from my personal life, or I'll talk about one example from my personal life. And I've talked about this before. Some of you, Maria and Jen, you're probably a little bit familiar with this, but my relationship, or my pattern, my unhealthy patterns in relationships throughout most of my adult life. And so for most of my adult life, starting in my early 20s, I kept falling into this pattern of avoidance in relationships. So if you're familiar with the avoidant and anxious relationship dynamic, there's lots of literature and studies done about this, about how one person becomes avoidant and pushes away the other person, and the other person becomes anxious and just wants to be closer, and it creates this unhealthy dynamic of one person always trying to get closer and the other person always pulling away. So I was always the avoidant person. So after an initial infatuation where I'd be completely and madly in love with the woman, after a few months, that infatuation would wear off, and then I would slowly start to become avoidant, slowly start to emotionally withdraw from the relationship, but often still remain in the relationship because either I didn't want to go through the pain of a breakup, and often I would try to deny the feelings I was having of wanting to withdraw. And then even after, when I started noticing this pattern, I just would try to resist it because I was starting to notice that I was going through the same pattern, and I would try to resist it, but I didn't know how to deal with it. And so I would just try to ignore it, try to repress those feelings, and that never worked. And so for many years, this kept playing out in relationships where I kept going through the same pattern of initial infatuation and then avoidance. And it was only very recently that I started untangling that mess that caused me to perpetuate this relationship pattern. And so it started untangling it a while ago. I had one relationship when I just started studying with my meditation teacher in my early 30s, and I just forced myself to stay in the relationship. And so over time, but I was constantly still going through cycles of, sometimes I would be able to open up and commit and be there and show up and be present in the relationship, but then oftentimes I'd pull away again. And even with my partner at the time, we started talking about this pattern because I was very aware of it. And so we would talk about it and both be aware of what was going on. But again, I didn't know how to break out of it. And so it still continued to cause a lot of pain even after I was aware of it. But then eventually, a few years ago, I started realizing that at the root of this avoidance, at the root of what caused me to emotionally withdraw from the relationships, was a fear of loss, at the root of the avoidance was actual insecurity, was wanting to be close in the relationship, but fearing that. And so pulling away to protect myself from the fear of being insecure. And so at one point, my avoidant pattern shifted and I started to become anxious in all my relationships. So this was in the last few years, the last several attempts at relationships, I became the insecure, anxious one. And I was always fearful that she was going to lose interest in me and pull away. And so that was, in some respects, being on both ends of the anxious and avoidant, being anxious is definitely worse. I feel like it's more painful, more crazy making. And so, at first it seemed like I was getting worse in relationships because even though I had broken out of the avoidant pattern, now I was in this anxious pattern, and that was even creating more misery for myself. And it wasn't until very recently, within the past month actually, that I had a breakthrough with my therapist. She pointed out something to me that at the root of that insecurity and the anxiousness was as a fear of loss, a fear of losing the love. And I finally kind of traced this back to a wound that I incurred as a child. And probably when I was around 7 or 8, I'm not sure. Some of this is speculation, some of this is kind of a feeling that I have. And I want to start off by saying that, so this is a wound from my mother. And I want to start off by saying that in most respects, I'm very grateful to my mom, both my parents. I had in many respects, a very positive upbringing. They were very supportive, very kind and attentive in most ways. But and I harbor no blame or resentment towards my parents about this. They're doing the best that they could. They were just reenacting the same wounds they inherited from their parents. And so that being said, I still developed this wound. And so I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I think from my perspective, what it felt like to me as a child, it seemed like at first my mother was very loving and physically affectionate with me. But then at some point around the age of 7 or 8, that physical affection stopped abruptly. And I experienced that as a loss of love. And that wounded me deeply. And then I think my first emotional avoidance, my pulling away, my emotional detachment was with my mother. Because I remember after that, as in middle school and high school, at dinner, when my mother would ask me how my day was, I didn't want to answer at all. I didn't want to tell her anything. And I kind of remember throughout most of my kind of adolescent years, just not wanting to let my mom in at all, not wanting to tell her anything about what was going on in my life, not opening up. I didn't want to emotionally open up to my mother. And I think that was a defense mechanism against my experience of that loss of love. And so even though she was there and still loving in ways, still supportive, that avoidance developed, and that keeping the emotional barrier up, that keeping that emotional wall up between. So I think that first started with my mother, and then that started playing out in my relationships. And the key breakthrough that my therapist helped me with was that once that initial infatuation wears off, that's when real intimacy can develop in a relationship. That's when the relationship can progress from just infatuation and the early romance into true intimacy and true love. And so at that point, that's when I would start to get scared of allowing myself to become emotionally committed to the relationship, because I was scared of losing it. And so I would get into this avoidant pattern where the relationship was still there, but I was not emotionally involved. And so therefore I couldn't lose the love again. I wasn't at risk of losing this love, but still I had the relationship there, and it's still the physical aspect, and I still could get the physical affection in the relationship, but not fear losing the love and not fear losing it. And so that's I really think is what led to many years of this unhealthy relationship dynamic. And it all goes back to this early childhood wound. And so it could be easy for me to see that dynamic as something to be ashamed of. And for a while, I was definitely ashamed of it. And I feel very guilty about all the pain I caused, or I still feel some guilt about all the pain I caused, but I was just doing the best that I was capable of, given my emotional development, my skills, my emotional coping skills at the time. And so this is just one example from my life, but the same thing can be applied to any unhealthy pattern, or almost any unhealthy patterns that we all have in our lives, not just relationship patterns, but any other, or relationships with substances, with alcohol, with work, with exercise, and with anything, food. Most of those unhealthy, unproductive patterns that we have stem from some unresolved wound. And so I think for kind of those addictive tendencies, I'm sure this is nothing new, but a lot of that drive to pursue that addictive tendency comes from wanting to distract ourselves from the internal pain, distract ourselves from the wound, or numb the pain of the wound. So but oftentimes society tells us that these urges that we have, these compulsive desires, society labels those as bad. I mean, especially, I think particularly our culture, which is influenced heavily by Christianity. And in Christianity, there's that idea that if you have bad thoughts, it's because you're a bad person. If you have desires, and if you have unhealthy desires or sinful desires, it's because you're a sinful person. And that teaches us to be ashamed of these desires or urges, which prevents us from taking an honest look at them and digging into them and figuring out what's causing them. So I think we could all benefit from removing the stigma of these unhealthy tendencies and allowing ourselves to honestly look at them, but realize these tendencies we have, these drives, these hurtful drives we have, these hurtful compulsions we have, they're not because we're bad people. They're not because we're weak or flawed or morally flawed people. It's just because we have these unresolved wounds that we don't know how to deal with. And so I think that's a good place to stop for now.